What the hell? Greetings and salutations. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange and the host who might be a ghost. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all manner of strange and unusual literature that I have found in my travels. Today I wanted to talk about a book that I read. If you recall in my Poetry Thursday video that I did earlier in the week, I said I was working on a particularly challenging book, a real chonker. So today I wanted to talk about a book that I just finished that deals with mental illness, haunted houses, maybe, fear, and love. And that book that I'm talking about is House of Leaves, which, of course, that you saw in the intro, by Mark Z. Danielewski. Pretty interesting book that I have a lot to say about. So this is as I said, this is a challenging book. So I'm going to it's going to sound a bit ranty at times what I have to say about this book, and this video might last a little longer than usual. So what I'm going to do is I'll put timestamps in the comments on when you can find each section, summary, analysis, and whatnot, in case you want to get to the more analysis heavy part, or if you want to just hear my summary and move on from there. That'll be groovy. So, who is Mark Z. Danielewski? Well, he is a postmodern type author. He's known for ergodic literature, which is a branch of literature that I've never heard of before. Ergodic literature focuses on sort of creating a different type of pathway to get from point A to B. You're not just doing the traditional narrative structure, you're making things a bit more complicated than that. Sometimes a bit more complicated than they need to be, but that's another point entirely. And so Mark Danielewski is familiar, or like not only familiar, but he engaged heavily with this, not only in his current book, but also in subsequent books that he's written over the years. So this was his debut novel in the year 2000. He's since written other books in that time. Presumably they're all equally as terrible, but I'll get to that later. Again, it's hard to summarize this book because there's so many narratives going on, and because it's ergodic, it's not following a traditional narrative that's easy to explain to others. But I will do my best. So the book focuses on sort of like 4 different narratives. Four different characters. It uses different variety of framing devices, like stories within stories within stories, to tell what's going on. The first story is about at its heart, it's about the Davidson record, about a family who moves into a new house and discovers that all is not as it appears to be, and what they have to deal with as they go on. And their experiences were turned into a documentary. So that's what's going on there. And then outside of that is a man named Zappano, who is a blind man who sort of went crazy writing about all this, and he gathered all the sources, all the information, and put it into one book. Sort of compiled all the manuscripts. And so this is equally his story, as he's writing footnotes and commenting and drawing comparisons and whatnot. This is also about Johnny Truant, who discovers Zappano's notes. And so the story is about him as he goes through life. Outside of that, and he it talks about how the story is affecting him as he learns more. Like, he feels that he's also slowly going crazy, and like things aren't going so well for him, which I think is interesting, like a sort of parallel right there. And then outside of that is us. I fully believe that Danielewski made us a part of the story, with the story structure and the various elements that he uses. we are very much characters, not on the same level as Johnny Truant or anything like that, but we are a part of this story, which I think is interesting. So there's just so much to talk about there. So at the heart of the narrative is the Davidson record. Basically, it's a documentary that followed a family as they moved into a new house in Virginia. There's Will Davidson, an accredited or acclaimed photojournalist. There's Karen Green, his long-term partner, who they've never gotten married for reasons addressed in the past, whether it be infidelity or lack of commitment. And they believe that this moving into a new house will help them fix their marriage. And then there's two children who are kind of forgotten about. Danielewski talks about them, but he never really defines who they are. They just seem extraneous to the story at hand. And they are Daisy and Chad. And that's probably the last time I'll say their names, because again, Danielewski he emphasizes them, but he doesn't drag them into the story, I feel, in a meaningful way. Again, this is Karen and Will's attempt to sort of salvage their relationship. And it goes fine at first. They're able to move into this house and get everything set and be comfortable. But one day they come back home and they discover a new closet has appeared where one wasn't before. And not only that, but the dimensions of the house are so wonky that the measurements on the inside are bigger than the measurements on the outside. So the house is larger, it would seem, than it should be, which Will obsesses over. Karen tries to forget it because it unnerves her. She doesn't want to think about it. As Will is trying to figure out more about that, another sort of door forms in their living room, and that door opens up into a large hallway that's dark and cold and weird and has a number of strange properties. But it essentially leads into a never-ending cavern of mazes and labyrinths, and it's very confusing. So Will is again obsessed with this, and so he calls his brother Tom and his friend Reston, and they try to figure out, well, what about this? What about this space? And at one point, Will explores it, but becomes disoriented and finds that the dimensions of the area he's in are shifting, so that the path that he traveled on to get there wasn't there anymore, and it's very discomforting and kind of very strange. Now at this point, Will also brings a new friend and his companions into this, Holloway, along with Jed and another friend, in an effort to further explore this vast area. They do a series of explorations where they discover more rooms and a staircase that goes down, but seemingly never ends. During one of the explorations, Holloway ends up finding the end of the staircase and just discovers more area to search. He also begins to hear a growling that other people have heard. It persists throughout the space and there's no real explanation for where it's coming from. Holloway just begins to follow that sound. He's very curious. However, in the process, he becomes disoriented and kind of confused, and the growling gets closer and closer to him, which makes him more anxious. As a result, he turns on the team, and some members get hurt. And so Will has to engage in a rescue mission along with Tom and Reston to get down there. And he finds that the distance has shortened for him, whereas it took 5 or so days to get down there for the Holloway's team. It only took him a matter of maybe a couple minutes. So they are able to get to the group, and in the process of rescuing them, Holloway turns against the group again, and they have to exchange gunfire, which results in Holloway just being lost and them abandoning him. And so there's still video on Holloway, and in the final moments, you can see Holloway sort of like dying, his last gasp. And what results is the light dying out, and you can sort of see like a strange creature and a growling kind of explode. Although it's uncertain if there was an actual creature there, or if it was just the house swallowing Holloway. And so this upsets Karen, and she decides to leave. And while they're all packing and getting ready to go, the house kind of envelops into chaos, and it starts to shift around again, and it results in Tom dying. This upsets, Will, and he decides that he's going to stick around and try to figure out more about the home, while Karen goes off and tries to finish the documentary that they made about the house. Meanwhile, Will goes to the house, and he ends up becoming disoriented and kind of lost in the vast cavernous area again. And it results in like him kind of just floating through space and getting absorbed by a blue light, similar to one that he had in his dreams in the past. And then Karen also goes in and searches for him, and she manages to rescue him, although he has a couple injuries in the process. They end up getting married, and that's the end of that story. So now I can move on to analysis. What can I say about House of Leaves? First, it's a very spooky and spine-chilling book. Danielewski does fear really well, and he also does a great job of disorienting you and getting you in the mindset of the characters here. A good example of this is sort of the beginning of the book, when Zappano is looking at Zappano's notes. And it kind of reads like an academic research paper, being a graduate of psychology. I have a familiarity with research papers, and it felt like like I was reading like a meta-analysis of some type of all the research that's been gathered about one specific topic. And it's fascinating, and it really gets you in the mindset of like, who are Will and Karen Davidson? What is the deal with this house? Why is it so strange? And I really wanted to learn more about it. It was pretty stuffy, and that's definitely one of the faults with this book. But it definitely gets you in the mindset and leaves you wanting to learn more about these weird phenomena that happen. Danielewski also disorients you through the use of emotion and the setting of the story. He uses the cavern, the vast hallway area, and the changing dimensions to really disorient you in the same way that the characters have been disoriented. When the cavern area is wide open, like he arranges the text so that it's wide open, and I'll put pictures around here to help explain that. And when it's cramped, he writes it in such a way that things feel cramped, and like you definitely want to get out of here as quick as possible. So if you're claustrophobic. And a very good example of this is when Holloway and Will go into the vast cavern area. Holloway goes in there and he's calm at first, but once he makes it down to the staircase and he begins to hear the growling noise, it disorients him in a way that everything sort of becomes a labyrinth, and so the text is arranged in very labyrinthy format, very confusing. And it really disorients you as the reader, because you're wondering, well, how do I read this? The text is sideways, or it's hard to navigate this, and it's really well done. And then when Will runs in, he's very confident and courageous. He has less fear going on for him, and so the paragraphs are much shorter and briefer, and it seems like the way is clear, and he gets there in a much shorter distance, so things seem to be much easier for him because of his emotion, and therefore it's much easier for us because we're in that mindset, and things are easier to read there. I do feel like Danielewski does a wonderful job at that. However, it does come across it does make this book feel like a chore to read at times, because how do you navigate all that text, especially when some of that text seems rather pointless? Sometimes he just lists names on the side, or architecture styles, and you're wondering, well, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Another thing I liked about the story is how Danielewski connected it to Greek mythology. One thing in particular is the story of the Minotaur. For those that don't know, the Minotaur was a story about King Minos. His wife gave birth to some deformed, bull man baby thing, and he had Daedalus set up a labyrinth, a maze, so he could be rid of the baby. He just set the baby in there. And then to avoid some sort of plague, he sacrificed like 7 or so children every couple of years to the Minotaur, which would guarantee that no plague would come and get them. However, you know, that doesn't seem like the best economic or social strategy to do that. So here comes Theseus comes along, and he's like, "Oh, I can slay your bull for you." And thanks to the help he received in the maze, he was able to slay the Minotaur and rescue a whole bunch of Athenians who were trapped in the labyrinth. And Danielewski applies that story in a different number of ways to the house in the story, to the specific cavernous area, because one, it's described multiple times as maze-like or like a labyrinth. And there's this persistent growling that's echoing throughout the labyrinth area. In particular, it sounds like it's getting closer to you, and you can never quite find where it's at. So it really seems like there's a minotaur or a beast-like creature who is stalking and getting ready to strike. Danielewski even calls it a creature darkness, which kind of gives it the feeling that this darkness has a personification, and again is stalking you through the hallway. And then multiple times there's actual reference to the Minotaur, which Zappano has written about, and he's crossed out Minotaur almost every chance that he can get, which kind of implies that Zappano has realized the horrifying truth that there is some sort of crazed beast stalking this labyrinth, and maybe even stalking us all, and he refuses to acknowledge it because of what it could mean. One last thing is I like how Danielewski uses this foundation of fear and horror to write about a love story. He's even acknowledged himself more so than any story that's designed to scare you. He's writing about love. The love of who? Between Will and Karen. From the beginning of the story, it is established that Will and Karen have had a troubled relationship. Karen has been unfaithful in the past. Will has been neglectful. He's been away on his job, and he just hasn't been focusing on Karen so much, even though she wants to be around him. It's established that she might be codependent on him at different points of the story. And so this new house is an opportunity for them to fix the mistakes of their past relationships, and really start anew, which is great for them. But much like many horror stories, things don't necessarily go as one would expect. When they discover this secret room in this vast area, like Karen is intent on ignoring it, possibly because of all the fear and anxiety of the unknown, while Will wants to explore more about it. And that creates a rift between them because, again, Will is being neglectful, and he's not acknowledging the issues within their relationship. And even after the conflict in the house, like, they go their separate ways, and only do they return when Will I think Will's experience in the house at the end is him acknowledging all of his past mistakes. Although, I don't know, it's very confusing why he went in the house the final time. It's not very well explained. I think it's one of Danielewski's weak points. But Karen acknowledges her infidelities, and Will does something else, and they eventually get back together, and they get married, although Danielewski notes that it's not exactly a happy ending because they're married. But Will still has injuries, and the whole family has experienced untold trauma while in this house. And that's not to say that did they even acknowledge the past problems of their relationship, that Karen and Will are kind of codependent on each other, and that there's no telling if Will's going to be neglectful again later on. One hopes so, but I think Danielewski did a great job of showing that maybe not every relationship is as beautiful as one thinks it is, and that the horrors of this house like peeled away everything that was wrong with their relationship, and only after like taking a look at the house and examining themselves do they have the opportunity to begin anew. So the house gave them the chance to grow, to fix past mistakes. Now it's up to them to heed that call. So it seems like with all I just said that I must really love this story, right? And indeed, it is a quality story, but I feel like Danielewski botches what could be the greatest story of all time. He ends up like telling a wonderful story, but because of the flaws and hang-ups with the story, it prevents it from becoming next level, in my opinion. And he does this in 3 key ways. The first way is by boring the reader to death. There are so many instances, like with Johnny's chapters, or with chapter 5, which is just about echoes and it seems to go nowhere, where it seems like Danielewski doesn't really have a point, and he's just wasting time. Like, there's even a point where Johnny goes on a long rant where he talks about, like, his original intention was to talk about a translation of German found in the text. And he ends up going on about how, like, he wants to bang a bunch of these women that he's met. And at the very end, like, the editors have an editor's note where they're like, yeah, we don't know where Johnny was going with this. And then they provide the translation of the German. And it really feels like Danielewski he says this multiple times. So like is Danielewski admitting that he's wasting our time? Is he trolling us? And is he trying to bore us to death on purpose as a way of, I don't know, gaining vengeance on someone who hurt him in the past? So another way he mangles this great opportunity he has is by treating the audience as though he were dumb. I complained about this before with Harlan Ellison, but Harlan Ellison is small potatoes compared to Danielewski. There are multiple points throughout the book where Danielewski goes out of his way to explain some of the themes that are popping up. And he does this through footnotes, or even Johnny Truant chiming in. And it seems like he's not giving me, the reader, or any of the readers, the chance to figure this out on their own. And maybe that's just the nature of the story, which is really unfortunate. There's a point where there's a footnote that pops up and it says, oh, this is an instance of the word grave. The word grave also pops up several other times in the Davidson record. And it's like, why did you just explain that to me? I could have figured that out on my own. Like, I'm a smart person. Why aren't you treating me like I'm a smart person, Danielewski? It seems like a real insult. And why should I even read your book if you don't trust me to figure out where you're going? Lastly, I would say that Danielewski mangles his book by just doing too goddamn much. This book is 700 pages long, and Danielewski uses every single one of those pages in his effort to maximize the telling of his story. He uses those pages to include footnotes, to include weird pictures, to write poems, to include a weird index, which, like, I feel like that's contributing to the whole you're not smart enough to realize this, but he includes all of that, and it's absurd, much to the detriment of the story, because it becomes so bogged down in its own details that I don't think it can coherently navigate around all that bogging down to tell the story that it wants to tell. And even if Danielewski had only done 50% of what he did here, it would still be a great story. Just cutting down on the gimmicks and all the tools that he uses to really scare you and get you in the mindset. You could still do that with 50% of the effort, and it would be a good story. And maybe you wouldn't have the same story that you do right now, but it'd still be a good story. You'd still have something solid that might be considered one of the best stories of all time. And it's just so complicated that it just undermines it. Like, 100 pages in, I'm like, okay, I get it, Danielewski. You can quiet down at any point in time, but no, he just ramps it up, and it's too much. And so you have to wonder, what is Danielewski's intent here? Is he trying to tell a story for the readers to enjoy? Or is he trying to create a magnificent work of art that you nod at and say, I get it, that's pretty interesting? Because if it's the latter, like if he considers it a work of art, then just sell it to the Guggenheim and stop wasting my time. If it's art, then why sell this as a book? I know that most books are art, but most books aren't art to the extent this book is, and it feels like you're supposed to look at it rather than read it, because if you read it, it just collapses. House of Leaves has often been compared to Moby Dick, and Stephen King has even said that the closest thing we have to the Moby Dick of horror is House of Leaves, and I feel that's a very fair description. Moby Dick is also a terrible book. Maybe not super bad, but Moby Dick wasn't appreciated in the time that it was written because Herman Melville was very focused on cosplaying as a whale fisherman, more so than he was about telling a decent story. And opinion on the book has changed over the years, possibly because we've all become Stockholm Syndrome to Moby Dick. But it is a fair comparison to make with this story. This story is like so much like how with Herman Melville became so preoccupied with whale boners and the philosophy of fishing. This story becomes preoccupied with the nature of insanity and the nature of fear, and it does contribute something to the book, much like with Moby Dick, but I feel it's less so in this case, just because it creates a large struggle, in my opinion. Like, a lot of the times, I'll say that Danielewski's head is so far up his own ass that I'm not sure what he's trying to say, or if what he's doing even works. And if he was up his head or up his ass a lot less, this story might come off as more palatable. And maybe I guess I'm arguing that the story isn't very palatable, in which case maybe Danielewski never intended for it to be palatable. But if you're making this to read, again, you have to make some compromises. And I'm not asking you to change the entire structure of your book. I'm just saying, trim it down, buddy. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on House of Leaves. Do I recommend this book? Well, that is a very difficult question. I don't think you should go and seek out this book for funsies without knowing what you're getting into. If you think that you can enjoy this book or enjoy what it represents, despite all the criticisms I just laid out, absolutely. Go ahead and read it. It's probably worth your time. But if you don't think that you can tolerate 700 pages of writing that sometimes goes nowhere at all, there are better pieces of media out there that do what House of Leaves did in a shorter and more succinct way. One piece of media is Hausu, which is a Japanese movie that is about a house that is mind-bending in a lot of ways. There's also the episode of Welcome to Night Vale called What Happened at the Smithwick House, and also Who's a Good Boy Part 1 and 2, that I feel get at the themes that Danielewski was trying to address. So yeah, I'm kind of torn between this being one of the greatest stories that I've ever read, and also it being one of the worst stories that I've ever read, and a big challenge that makes me want to scream. So I'm kind of torn there. Make that of what you will, I guess. So if you read this book, or you want to comment on something that I've said here, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to discuss this with you. Otherwise, like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear about more stories that make me just have violent reactions like this. That'll be quite fun. In the meantime, I wish you a pleasant time in your weird travels. Goodbye.